America's middle class once defined the country's identity. It represented hope, security, and the belief that each generation could live better than the last. But today, that foundation is crumbling, and millions of Americans are wondering, what went wrong? How did the middle class fall apart? And more importantly, is there a way to rebuild it? For decades after World War II, the American economy was booming. Manufacturing jobs were plentiful, wages were strong, and home ownership was realistic for many families. The US economy became the envy of the world, and the middle class flourished. But under the surface, cracks were forming, cracks that would eventually widen into chasms. In the 1970s, things began to change. Factories started closing, and jobs were shipped overseas to cut costs. The rise of globalization made it harder for American workers to compete with cheaper labor markets abroad. People who had spent their lives working in factories were suddenly left with few options, and many ended up in lower-paying service jobs. At the same time, wages stagnated. While worker productivity increased, paychecks didn't keep up. The cost of living steadily rose. Housing prices, healthcare costs, and education expenses all climbed higher and higher. Yet wages barely moved, making it harder for families to make ends meet. The gap between the rich and everyone else grew wider. In the 1970s, CEOs earned about 30 times what the average worker made. Today, that figure has skyrocketed to over 300 times. The wealthiest 1% of Americans now hold more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. As the rich got richer, the middle class was squeezed tighter and tighter. Debt became a lifeline and a trap. People turned to credit cards to cover basic expenses. Student loans ballooned as college became a necessity for many jobs. Medical debt crippled families, even those with insurance. People worked longer hours, took on multiple jobs, and sacrificed their personal lives just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the social safety nets that once helped protect struggling families began to weaken. Pensions disappeared, replaced by risky 401k plans. Healthcare remained tied to employment, meaning a job loss could also mean losing insurance. Government programs meant to help the vulnerable faced repeated budget cuts, leaving people with fewer options when hard times hit. Housing became another massive obstacle. Investors snapped up properties, driving up prices and turning homes into rental properties. First-time buyers were priced out of the market, and rising rents consumed larger portions of people's paychecks. The American dream of home ownership, once a hallmark of middle-class life, became an unattainable fantasy for many. Education, once seen as a path to a better life, became a financial burden. Tuition costs soared, and students were forced to take on enormous debt just to get a degree. And even with a diploma, many graduates found themselves in jobs that barely paid enough to cover their loans, let alone allow them to build a stable future. Corporations thrived, but workers struggled. Tax cuts for the wealthy, stock buybacks, and relentless lobbying ensured that policies favored the powerful. Politicians promised to help the middle class, but often passed legislation that benefited big businesses instead. The people who built America's wealth were left behind, while corporations posted record profits. Retirement, once a reward for a lifetime of hard work, became another casualty of the collapsing middle class. Savings accounts dwindled as people used whatever money they had to survive day to day. The promise of a secure retirement faded, replaced by the fear of working until death or relying solely on Social Security. The stress of financial insecurity took a toll on mental and physical health. People skipped doctor visits, ignored warning signs, and pushed through exhaustion because they couldn't afford to miss work. The pressure to survive in a broken system led to burnout, depression, and a growing sense of hopelessness. Yet, despite all this, people kept fighting. Communities came together to support one another. Movements advocating for higher wages, better healthcare, and fairer tax policies grew louder. Workers went on strike, demanding the pay and respect they deserved. And more people began to understand the root causes of middle-class decline: systemic inequality, corporate greed, and policies that prioritized profits over people. Change is possible, but it requires collective action. It means voting for leaders who prioritize workers' rights, It means pushing for policy changes like universal healthcare, affordable education, and stronger labor protections. It means holding corporations accountable and demanding a system where prosperity is shared, not hoarded by the few. The collapse of America's middle class isn't inevitable. It's a result of choices made over decades. And just as those choices dismantled the middle class, new choices can rebuild it. But only if people stay informed, stay engaged, and refuse to accept a system that leaves millions struggling while the wealthy thrive. Because the middle class is more than an economic category, it's the heart of the nation. And without it, the American dream will remain just that, a dream, rather than a reality for future generations,